All right, thanks for joining me today for this discussion that we're going to have on the issues of storage tank sludge, biomass accumulation, and Bell Performance's tank treatment solution for these issues called Bell Tank Treatment SDF. I am Eric Bjornstad. I'm the Technical Information Director here at Bell Performance. And what we want to try and cover today is we want to talk about some common problems that a lot of storage tank people, storage tank users face. We want to do an overview or give you a little overview of the tank treatment SDF product, talk a little bit about its functions, what it does, how to properly apply it. We want to talk about some common questions that may help you understand a little better how it works and how best to use it. And we want to do a little bit of a market overview of the kinds of people, the possible users who would be interested in using tank treatment SDF and who would get some good benefits out of it. So with that in mind, let's get started by looking at some of the areas of concern that storage tank sludge causes us to have to consider a little more closely. We want to talk about what storage tank owners see and sometimes don't see. You know, a typical storage tank that has stored fuel for more than just a little bit of time is likely to have at least one of these kind of issues. First one is sludge buildup. You know, what does sludge buildup do? Well, it plugs up filters and it takes away fuel heating value. Those are a couple of the problems that it causes. You know, if you've been with us or if you've seen any of our other trainings or read the blog, you know that petroleum fuel stability, it degrades over time because of the exposure to a number of different factors, whether it's oxygen, whether it's water, heat, or microbial buildup in the tanks. You know, there are a lot of things that inevitably cause its stability to degrade. And when this happens, you have the heavier fractions of the fuel, including some long polymers that may form over time, you know, those become insoluble, they drop out of the fuel, and they collect at the bottom of the storage tank. This problem actually becomes more pronounced the heavier the fuel is. So it's a worse problem in number 2 diesel storage than it is in gasoline, and it's a worse problem in heavy fuel oil than it is in number 2 diesel. Problem is that this sludge, well, it plug filters, so you have to replace the filters more often. And because it used to be part of the fuel, when it's no longer in the fuel being burned, that's lost heating value. So you're not getting as much out of the fuel as you paid for, basically. Second problem that storage tank owners see, microbes and biomass. You know, the association of free water in storage tanks and microbial growth, you know, that's well known. The link between those two is well known within the industry. And one consequence of this is that storage tanks will tend to get biomass formations in them. Now, biomass it's a matrix of biological film, biological material, and it's produced over time by microbial colonies. And the problem here is that these biomass formations, they stick to surfaces. I mean, sometimes they'll float around in fuel, the tank's big enough, but more often than not, they'll end up building up on tank surfaces, and they'll have microbes in them and behind them. And this is a problem because if a storage tank owner is on top of things and recognizes that they have a microbe problem, well, they know that in order to solve a microbe problem, they have to use a biocide. And the biocide will kill everything that it comes in contact with. But if it can't get to the microbes that are being shielded by the biomass, well, then those microbes won't be killed by the biocide. It's not as effective as it should be, and they can stick around to cause future problems later on. Third problem that a lot of storage tank owners see, tank corrosion. You know, tank corrosion typically due to a couple of different factors. You know, if you have free water in it, well, free water in and of itself will lead to tank corrosion, but also just microbial presence. One of the byproducts, consequences of microbial presence is that they produce acids and you know, biological byproducts that cause corrosive damage to the tanks over time. And so, not only is the problem that the tank itself is being damaged and will eventually have to be repaired at fairly substantial cost, but also when you get rust from corrosion, well, that floats around in the tank or sinks to the bottom, and that can contaminate fuel, and it can plug filters. So these are serious and costly problems that storage tank owners see, and so they're worth developing a solution for. And in fact, Bell Performance has developed a solution for these problems. We developed this solution because of some of the issues we are seeing and being told about by our customers over on the fuel additive side, over in some of the municipalities, the cities and counties that we have done business with for decades. So that treatment, that solution that we developed, is one that we call Tank Treatment SDF. Tank Treatment SDF. SDF stands for Sludge Dispersant Formula, and it was really formulated as a response to some microbial tank problems that one of our municipal county customers was experiencing. It was introduced. We introduced it in early 2015, so it's one of the newest formulations for Bell Performance at this period in time. Depending on when you're accessing this training, and we introduced it because we had a customer that had a tank that had a fairly conventional microbe problem. So the tank was treated with Bellicide, which is Bell Performance's biocide, and it killed everything that it was supposed to, and the tank checked out, microbe count checked out clean, and seemed like everything was okay. Then they came back, it wasn't very long, then maybe 2 weeks later they come back and say, well, we've got the microbes are back in our tank. And as it turns out, their experience is not uncommon. Basically what was found was that, again, these microbes, they produce biomass formations, and the biomass formations form in various and accumulate in various areas of the fuel distribution system, and so they have microbes that were shielded from the biocide. So the tank system checked out, the fuel checked out clean and microbe-free. Then they probably had a fuel drop, and the fuel drop went and disturbed the biomass, allowing those microbes to reintroduce themselves back into the tank, essentially re-inoculating the tank. So the solution to this was to develop something that could be used alongside a biocide, or even independently of the biocide, something that would break up the biomass and enable those microbes to be then killed by the subsequent biocide application. So that was the impetus for Tank Treatment SDF to be developed and introduced, and it has proven to be a pretty essential part of Bell Performance's stored fuel treatment arsenal. So what does it do? What does Tank Treatment SDF do? Well, first thing it does is it absorbs and disperses the petroleum fuel sludge. It reduces sludge deposition in all areas of the fuel system. Over time, when it comes in contact with the sludge, once it's in the fuel, it comes in contact with fuel sludge, and it will absorb and it will disperse heavy sludge deposits into the fuel. Now, over time, as you leave it in that tank, over time, the sludge presence in the tank and that fuel distribution system is reduced everywhere that treated fuel contacts. So storage tanks, fuel delivery lines, fuel injectors and injection guns, all of those places will be cleaned out over time. And so the dispersed sludge, the absorbed sludge, is then goes out and is combusted with the rest of the fuel. The second thing that SDF does is it provides corrosion protection. It was formulated with an amide chemistry, which lays down a layer, what we call a barrier, or a boundary layer of protection on all the tank surfaces that the treated fuel touches. And so this protective barrier essentially shields and protects that metal surface from corrosive damage by other things that may come along. Now, this protection lasts as long as the treated fuel is in contact with surfaces. It's not, and we call it a barrier protection because it does not chemically bond to the surface. So once the fuel goes away, that protection will go away. One of the reasons why we recommend treating the fuel ongoing with SDF. Now, the fact that it doesn't chemically bond to the metal surface and the fact that it will go away once the fuel isn't there anymore, this doesn't tend to be a problem from a practical sense, because most corrosion happens when or while fuel is contacting tank surfaces. You do see some corrosion above the fuel line, but that corrosion, typically microbially related, like vapor corrosion, that can be remediated by using the coordinating biocide along with SDF. So fuel sludge absorption and corrosion protection, two things that SDF does. Third thing that SDF does is it, as we mentioned before, it disperses biocide, and therefore it enhances the effectiveness, disperses biomass, and therefore enhances biocide efficacy. When it disperses the biomass, then the previously protected microbes aren't protected anymore, and the subsequent biocide will kill more of them, and therefore it helps prevent fuel system reinoculation. And this is not an inconsequential thing, because if you think about it, if you're a fuel tank owner, storage tank owner, and you have a microbial problem, and you have finally come around to the realization that you need to treat it with biocide, you have certain expectations, right? And if you treat with the biocide and you do everything that they tell you that you're supposed to, and then that problem comes back in 2 weeks, first of all, how much of a headache is that going to cause you? And what are you going to think about the biocide that you use? Well, you're probably going to think that you were sold a bill of goods. That's why it's a good thing from Bell Performance's standpoint to be able to have something like this, because our biocide, Bellicide, its chemistry is one of the best on the marketplace, and we certainly don't want important customers using it and then calling us back saying this stuff was worthless, my problem's back in a couple of weeks, what are you guys trying to sell me? So SDF definitely has some value both for the customer end and also, of course, from our end, because there's plenty of, shall we say, worthless stuff out there in the fuel additive market, and we've worked very hard over the years to differentiate ourselves from all the fly-by-night people. So this just really helps us continue to do that. As with many things, SDF works best when it's applied properly. Now, if you've seen any of our trainings on the DFS plus water controller, if you've seen the biocide training and the biocide products descriptions, the same principles still apply here. It only works if it comes in contact with what it's supposed to be treating. So it has to come in contact with sludge, has to come in contact with the biomass in order to do something about them. It's not going to work by telekinesis or osmosis. It has to physically come in contact with them. And therefore, it matters how you apply it. Application method matters. The best application method is going to be the one that puts it into the closest contact with the sludge and the biomass for the longest period of time. Now, typically there are four main ways that people will apply this kind of thing. Some are good, some are not so good. The worst one is probably, it's the worst one, but it's also the easiest, unfortunately. It's funny how those things kind of work. And that is it's the addition on top of the fuel, and then they just leave it there. They say, well, I'm just going to pour it into the tank, and then I'll just leave it. And so what they're relying on is they're relying on diffusion. They're relying it to spread by diffusion through the fuel, eventually reach the sludge, and then do what they're expecting it to do. Well, unfortunately, that takes a long time. You don't get the best contact. You don't get the maximum contact either. And it's probably not going to work anywhere near as well as they're expecting. So addition to fuel with diffusion is really unsatisfactory, not a good way to do it. Now, addition to existing fuel and then adding fuel on top, that's certainly a lot better than just relying on diffusion. This is the old splash blending technique where somebody will add it to a tank that's half full, and then they've got a scheduled fuel drop to fill it, back up to capacity. And so they put the fuel, the new fuel on top of the treated fuel that churns and mixes together. That's better because you're going to get more contact. It's not quite as systematic as some of the others, but if you don't have the ability to do one or the other, then this would be the method that you would default to. Addition with fuel circulation. This is probably the best recommended way to do it. And it's also the best recommended way, not only because it puts it in contact the most, but because more people have the ability to do this. So you add it to the fuel, and then you use an existing circulation system to basically circulate the fuel for a given amount of time. The fourth one is a direct injection. Now, some people, or I should say not everybody, has the ability to do this, but for people who move a lot of fuel, they many times have the equipment where they can inject it directly into a bulk fuel stream. This gets excellent mixing and is an excellent way to apply the product. So addition with fuel circulation and direct injection are probably the two best practice ways to do it. And they're best practice because they maximize and increase the residence contact that the treated fuel has with the sludge and the biomass, and thus enables it to work most effectively. SDF, one good thing about SDF is that it is highly concentrated. It was formulated to work at treat rates between 1 to 10,000 and 1 to 20,000. It was formulated in this way because people who move a lot of fuel tend to have tighter margins, and so while they may need to solve the kind of problems we were talking about earlier, they have to be able to do it in a cost-effective manner. And SDF, we think, really helps them to do that. So the default treat rates are between 1 to 10,000 and 1 to 20,000. But sometimes you can adjust the effective treat rate dependent upon the amount of sludge that's in the tank and the volume of fuel that's in the tank. This speaks to the fact that a SDF is a kind of fuel treatment that's a little bit different than some of the others. When you think about it, if you were to take all of the fuel additives or types of fuel treatments and divide them into categories, well, you've got, on the one hand, you've got fuel treatments that change the specifications of the fuel. That would be things like a cetane improver. That would be something like a lubricity improver. On the other hand, you've got treatments that solve problems by addressing things outside of the fuel. That would be water absorbers and sludge dispersants like this. So when you look at cetane improvers and lubricity agents, you have a fairly clearly defined idea of how much you need of those to put in the fuel in order to get the desired effect. You know how much we can know with a reasonable amount of certainty how much cetane improver, what percentage we need to put into diesel fuel of a given kind to raise its existing cetane number by 4 points or whatever we want to get it to. However, when you're looking at treating water or when you're looking at dispersing sludge, your effective treat rate really depends on how much water or how much sludge you've got in that tank. And it's not always easy to know, what the answer to that is, because many times, you can recognize a sludge problem by things like, filter plugging, but it's really, really difficult to know exactly how much sludge you've got in a tank, because very rarely can anyone actually go into a tank to measure it. Another thing that affects the or influences rather the effective treat rate is the volume of fuel or the volume of liquid that's in the tank. And why this matters is because it affects how the treatment contacts the sludge or contacts the biomass. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to make it less effective, but what it may do is it may change the amount of time that's necessary for it to work. If you have seen our training on DFS plus water dispersant, it's the same principle. If you have two tanks, and let's say one is a small tank, like a 500-gallon tank, the other one is a 10,000-gallon tank, and they both have the same volume of sludge in them. Let's say they have the equivalent of 5 gallons of sludge, or however you want to. You could say half an inch, however you want to put it. Same amount of sludge in both tanks, so theoretically you should need the same amount of SDF. However, if one's got 500 gallons of fuel, that SDF is going into 500 gallons of essentially solvent. The other one is going into 10,000 gallons. So same amount of SDF is going in, but what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to increase the circulation time, and you're going to have to allow for a longer time for that larger tank to work, simply because of the dynamics of the amount of fluid that's in that tank. Now, common questions that we've been asked, since this is a relatively new product for Bell, there have been certain questions that will come up. You may be formulating some of these questions may have cropped up in your mind as we've been looking at this, or if you're a Bell staff member, then these are ones that people out in the field are likely to ask. So one question we get is, if you treat sludgy fuel with SDF, how's it going to change the mileage? Is it going to improve the mileage? It's going to decrease it? What's going to be the effect? And the answer to this is that you would be likely to expect a small drop in mileage as compared to fresh fuel, not as compared to the sludgy fuel that's already in there. Now, the nuance there is that fresh fuel is going to get the maximum mileage because it's in good condition. Now, that fresh fuel was left in the tank for a period of time, and it started to break apart, and part of its energy content left it in the form of sludge. So, if you take that sludge and you draw it back up into the fuel, and then it goes out into the combustion chamber, sludge molecules will burn, but they won't burn as efficiently as virgin fuel. So, if you're comparing the mileage that you got when the fuel was fresh, the mileage that you're going to get now may be lower. However, you're going to get the concurrent benefit of having a cleaner tank and a cleaner engine, which will definitely return great value to you over time. Second one is, does SDF remove 100% of sludge? Bell Performance does business on an international level, and this was one question that was asked: is if you treat sludgy fuel, if you aim to remove sludge with SDF, can you guarantee that it removes 100% of sludge? That's a fair question. It's a little bit of a naive question, which is not a bad thing. It's not bad to be naive because not everybody is an expert on every area. But basically, if you look at the chemical composition or the molecular composition of sludge composition often includes certain elements that simply aren't soluble in fuel, certain kinds of asphaltenes. So it's going to absorb and redisperse all of the soluble components of the sludge that are present. So it's going to solvate and remove most of it, but it won't. But the stuff that's not soluble, there's nothing that's going to be able to put that into the fuel. Another question that we get asked is, how does it change the color of the fuel? Well, and that's dependent upon a couple of things. But so sludge, when fuel's unstable, when it's got sludge dropping out, the fuel becomes darker. The color changes. So if the fuel is already dark, then it's not going to make the fuel more dark than it was before. It's possible that it will change the color by making it lighter, though, and that's a good thing, because if you've got black fuel to start with, and then the fuel goes back to more the reddish dyed color that it was before, well, then that's a pretty good indication that that sludge that it's done something worthwhile. What kind of people would find the most value with SDF? Internally, we would say, what kind of market verticals would be more likely to want to use tank treatment SDF? Well, if you know anything about Bell Performance's product line, you know that we have a fuel storage suite that is comprised of Bellicide, which is a biocide, DFS Plus water absorber, and Diesel Life fuel stabilizer. So the same markets that use those products would be also applicable for tank treatment SDF. So you're talking about places like mission critical systems, mission critical installations that absolutely positively must have their stored fuel work at any point in time, because an emergency can strike at any point in time. Same thing for emergency generation systems. Same deal with them. Fleets that store fuel, they don't want their trucks, their truck diesel engines being adversely affected by sludgy fuel deposits. So they will find great benefit. And the market propositions for these folks, well, think about it. For mission critical and emergency systems, value proposition is your system is going to do what you need it to at the most critical times. For fleets, you're going to have cleaner engines, you're going to have better performance, your mileage will probably improve, and for anyone with stored fuel that has microbial issue, there's a huge value proposition, because it's going to better help them get rid of any microbial problem that they have, and that's a huge deal for anyone who stores fuel. So, in review, storage tanks, all storage tanks have the potential to have pretty significant problems with sludge, microbial biomass, subsequent tank corrosion issues. So Bell formulated tank treatment SDF to address all of these problems and do it in one concentrated formulation that's economical to use for all users. And it's an excellent product that works well, but it has best practice applications that are highly recommended for users to follow. So at this point, this brings us to the end of our discussion on tank treatment SDF. If you're watching this internally, then you would have a chance to ask me questions and clarify some points. But we understand that there may be some who are watching this remotely, or you may be watching this on the web, so you obviously don't have the opportunity to ask me questions. So that's why we have my email on this screen. If you have any questions, you can send me an email at ebjornstad@bellperformance.net. Just send me an email to reference that you were watching the tank treatment SDF training presentation and you have some questions. I will be more than happy to try and answer any questions that you have. So just send me an email at that email address, ebjornstad@bellperformance.net. So that is all for today on SDF. Thanks very much for joining me, and I hope that you found this interesting. And but more importantly, we hope that you found this useful and that it gives you some takeaways that you'll be able to use. So my name is Eric Bjornstad again. I'm a Technical Information Director with Bell Performance. And this concludes our presentation. Thanks for joining me today. Bye-bye.